am talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky. Fyodor Dostoevsky, born in 1821 and died in 1881. Dostoevsky is my favorite author far and away. And Dostoevsky is also, I will tell you, for me personally, I would probably put two of his books in my top 5 most influential books on my own thinking. Dostoevsky ranks up there, is one of those candidates as the greatest authors of, at least in all of Western literature. And probably 2 of his novels would rank in perhaps the top 5 greatest novels of Western literature, The Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment. As his name would suggest to you, he was Russian. And I add him to this list of our 6 great Christian men because Dostoevsky's influence was vast, and it continues to be the case today. And yet Dostoevsky is one of those figures whose humanity, his frailty, his own personal faults and weaknesses were ever near the surface in his life. Dostoevsky was the son of a minor nobleman, and as distinguished, say, from Tolstoy, who was from the nobility of the highest rank. And so there's a very big difference in socially stratified Russia. Tolstoy's family, Tolstoy, who was a contemporary, by the way, Tolstoy, who was a little, let's see, Tolstoy was born in, I think, 1825 and died in 1910. So these two, their lives overlapped. I'll tell you a little bit more. They knew each other and hated each other, and tell you just a little bit more about that. But Tolstoy's family had the right to call at court on the Tsar. They had that sort of presence in Russia. Tolstoy's family members had been advisors to the Tsar and were famous generals and things of this nature. Not so Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's family was broke. They had spent themselves into oblivion. He had some social ranking, but he didn't have any money. His father was probably murdered when he was about 16 years old, perhaps by his own peasants, his own serfs. There were no charges, there was no investigation. His body was left in a field, and no one knew for sure exactly what happened, but that made an indelible impression upon Dostoevsky's life, and it's a theme that would be replayed again and again in his novels. His father was a bit of a drunkard, and he was a man who of many passions. And this character is reflected, at least Sigmund Freud thought this character was reflected in the main, he's not the main character, but the father figure in the novel The Brothers Karamazov. If you've ever read that novel, if you haven't, you should. It's fabulous stuff. I'll also tell you this, by the way, Dostoevsky's novels, don't try watching the films. And the reason you can't is because they don't translate to film at all. Because his novels are deeply psychological. And so there is what I will call inner dialogue constantly, which doesn't translate to film. You don't have that. So what you end up with when you take The Brothers Karamazov and you put it, or Crime and Punishment, and put it in film, is you end up with something like Monk, or Columbo. It dumbs it way down. And Dostoevsky is getting at something a great deal more profound than that. In any case, Dostoevsky himself was also a man of many passions, and he as a young man, he declared himself an atheist and a socialist. This is well before, the Russian Revolution takes place in 1917, and it was throughout the 19th century that Russia is going through these rumblings, this precursor of a major convulsion that would come in the 20th century in the form of the Bolshevik Revolution. But throughout the 19th century, you begin seeing various socialist groups begin to emerge. Some of them were little more than reading groups. Others sought the overthrow of the Tsar. Dostoevsky belonged to both. And he was sort of a budding intellectual. He was interested very much in writing, though he had spent some time. He went to a military academy, spent 4 or 5 years in the military, came out, and began writing. And while he was yet an atheist, he wrote his first book, which was called Poor Folk. And this was made a huge splash, and other writers declared there is a new, budding, gifted author on the scene. In 1849, however, Dostoevsky was arrested as being part of a group called the Petrashevsky Circle, doesn't matter, but one of many thousands of such groups in Russia at this time, and accused of plotting to overthrow the Tsar. Now, the Tsar at the time was a man by the name of Nicholas I, and not to be confused with Nicholas II, who was, with Anastasia and so forth, who were all shot in July of 1918 at the order of Lenin, not to be confused with the last Tsar of Russia. This Tsar, who became Tsar in 1825 after something called the Decembrist Revolt, which was a very serious revolutionary effort to, this is 10 years after the Napoleonic Wars, and Russian soldiers who have seen Paris, they have seen the West, they have experienced the freedoms of the West, they come back to Russia with plans of changing Russia and westernizing it. And a group of officers who are known as the Decembrists endeavor to take over the military and overthrow the Tsar unsuccessfully in 1825, and at the very time that the previous Tsar, Alexander I, who was something of a westernizer himself, has died. And during this interim, from what shall I say, from the transition of Alexander I to Nicholas II, the Decembrist strike in an effort to gain power. They are unsuccessful. They are imprisoned or shot or both. And Nicholas, I think I said Nicholas II, but I meant to say Nicholas I. Nicholas I became known as the Iron Tsar because of the way he dealt with potential or actual revolutionaries. So, when the case of, here we are some 24 years later in 1849, Dostoevsky and his bunch, the secret police had been observing them for a very long time and rounded them up before they could enact their effort to kill the Tsar. They probably weren't going to be. This was really disorganized stuff. These were not people who really had the means or the ability or the planning to pull out this kind of effort. Perhaps like these women who were just arrested in New York, who apparently had some plans of building some big bomb or something to that effect. But in any case, they were all arrested nonetheless. And, I will tell you this just as a side note. Russia has never really been great at much of anything but their secret police. I mean, they have a long history of secret police that goes all the way back to Peter the Great, who died in, 1725, I think it was, and well before even to Ivan the Terrible back in the 16th century. So the names changed, the organization stayed the same. You know, it's now the FSB, it was the KGB, and before that it was the NKVD, and before that it was the Cheka, and before that it was the Third Section, and before that it was the Oprichnina, and so forth. The point is, the methodology that is employed by Putin has been honed, sharpened for centuries. They've been doing it. And so groups like Dostoevsky's, they were already had been penetrated by informers and so forth, and at the right time they're all rather easily rounded up and they are imprisoned. And they were sentenced to be, and I don't recall how many of them, but it was a lot of them, they were sentenced to be shot. But it was a mock execution, but Dostoevsky did not know this. I mean, what would be the point of a mock execution if you did know it? So here they are, they're marched to the wall or to the post, and you come to this pivotal moment. Ready, aim, and at the last moment, someone gallops in with a piece of paper and says, wait, the Tsar has commuted their sentence to hard labor in Siberia. And Dostoevsky says that on his way to being, you know, here he is going from the prison cell to the wall. He says that on his way there, he wanted to believe that there was something beyond this life than what he believed in up to that moment, that there was nothing. I mean, an atheistic worldview is a dangerous worldview. It's a worldview that says this life is all you get. It says that there's no foundation for ethics, for love, for meaning, none of it. And so Dostoevsky says that he turned to one of his fellow conspirators and he said, "Today we shall be with Christ." And the other man, the two worldviews presented side by side, said, "No, nothing but dust." You know, this is it. We're just gone, and we just revert to the soil, and we cease to exist. But Dostoevsky would later say that in that moment, the old man died and the new man was born. That is to say that Dostoevsky's conversion took place there. It took 2 weeks. I mean, if you can imagine, and in temperatures that sometimes reach below, 40 below, 2 weeks by sled, going all the way out to Siberia, where Dostoevsky would report in a story called Notes, what's it called? The House of the Dead, excuse me, not Notes from the Underground, in which he talks about his lice-infested cell and forced isolation. Today, we're told that the FSB or the KGB, whatever you prefer, does this in a much more technologically sophisticated way. But in these days, it worked pretty well too, and that is forced isolation. We have some reports of the way this was done, that you're placed into a cell and you are denied all human contact. To the degree that your guards, you didn't see them, they wore felt bottom boots, so you didn't even hear them. The idea was that you were to feel utterly and completely alone. And I hope no one in this room has ever suffered this. I doubt it, but we are told that this kind of loneliness, not hearing other voices, no one to talk to, not even the sense that there's even anyone nearby, is crushing in its effect on the human mind and spirit. And Dostoevsky developed frontal lobe epilepsy, and he was allowed one book, the Gospels. I guess that's 4 books, though it's often referred to as, at least in the Russian, it's referred to as one, as the 4 Gospels. But anyway, he read them again and again and again during his 4 years of imprisonment. And after he was released, he spent another 4 or 5 years in the military there on the Chinese border, where he was, that is to say, it wasn't optional. This was kind of a part of his imprisonment, was to serve in the military yet again in the harshest of circumstances. And eventually, during this time, he met and he married a woman by the name of Maria. And again, this is where we get at the real frailty of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky would describe his marriage to Maria as a woman that he simultaneously loved and hated. He would say that the two of us, where we were drawn together by passion and forced apart by a similar passion. And he says some think that one of the characters in the Brothers Karamazov, one of the female characters, one of the mothers of Alyosha and Ivan in that novel, that is referred to as the Shrieker, a woman who is constantly upset over something and is emotionally this pendulum that is just all over the place. Some think that Dostoevsky based this woman on his first marriage, his first wife, Maria. And it's interesting to note, and this, by the way, is a theme often in Russian literature. There's a kind of a misogynistic element to Russian literature. There's also, by the way, on the themes, if I were teaching on Russian literature right now, I'd say look for anti-Semitism. It's often there. Look for elements of misogyny. And you might also look for themes regarding the autocracy and the Orthodox Church and so forth. But in any case, his marriage to Maria was not a happy one. But Dostoevsky, like Tolstoy, they tended to view women as, if you read the novels, it's almost funny. Because women are depicted in both Dostoevsky and Tolstoy's literature as these beings that are like sirens. You know, if you're, what's the name of that movie? Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Yeah, sirens. I mean, they're depicted as characters who draw men to the shores of their destruction. This theme runs throughout Dostoevsky's literature. Often they're kind of, particularly in Tolstoy, and in his writing, women are often kind of one-dimensional. They're sort of shallow. They're social butterflies who offer very little of substance. You talk to them, and and there's just not much going on there. For Dostoevsky, he certainly had plenty of female characters who were like that, but he also had female characters who had depth and were heroines. And this certainly is a theme that comes up in two of his greatest novels, the Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment. But women are also depicted as those things that men simply can't resist, and it will lead them to their doom. The theme of Christianity and of God runs through all of Dostoevsky's writing, pre-Christian and Christian, because he was obsessed with, and maybe that's not the right word, maybe that gives a picture that somehow is psychologically imbalanced. He saw as important, as he should, the issue of God's existence or non-existence mattered. And so it comes up in his writing a lot. And so before he was a Christian, he obviously thought this was an important issue. Hence the reason he was an atheist. And once he converted, he had a Pauline kind of conversion. He turned completely the other way around. Just as he had been 100% against God, he was now 100% for God. Just as he had been 100% for socialism, what we often associate with communism, he is now 100% against it. And this is important because for Dostoevsky, socialism and atheism are the same thing. He says that two of them are linked. They go together. The idea of Christian socialism is sheer nonsense. Socialism begins with the basic assumption that there is only the material world. There is no spiritual world. There's only this world. Human beings and everything in it are mere commodities. And we try to build, the way he puts it, he says socialism is not building a tower to mount heaven. It is to try to bring heaven down to earth. And this is a really important element in Dostoevsky's writing. Because Dostoevsky began to understand that socialists began with this idea that the state is eternal and man is temporal. Dostoevsky would conclude that exactly the opposite is the case. The state is temporal, man is eternal. And therefore, instead of man serving the eternal state, the state should serve eternal man. And there's a big difference between those two concepts. It's one I think we're wrestling with right now. I would suggest to you that this is what's carrying the day throughout most of the world, even among democratic regimes anymore. Dostoevsky was very wary of this kind of philosophy, and he combated it with his writing and his post-Christian writing all deals with this. And so he saw his writing as a means of conveying spiritual higher truths. Now, Nabokov would later criticize Dostoevsky a lot for this. He says, they're just evangelistic, the stuff he writes. Yeah, it is. Dostoevsky didn't want to write about shallow, superficial things. He's not like reading a fuzzy Westerner like Chekhov, for instance, who dealt with simpler, more fun themes. Dostoevsky wanted to write about things that mattered, big questions. So when you read a novel like The Brothers Karamazov, the theme that he's working out throughout the whole novel is this one question. If there is no God, there can be no virtue, and all things are permissible. If there is no God, there can be no right and wrong, and everything is permissible that you can get away with. That is to say, there's no eternal punishment for doing anything. Yes, there just is and isn't. There's just what you do and you don't do. And he's playing with that theme throughout the book so that you have a central character who is an atheist and who believes this philosophy, and another one who is a Christian who doesn't. And the two are locked into a kind of spiritual and intellectual battle throughout the whole book until the atheist commits suicide. Almost every one of his books, the atheist commits suicide. But it's because for Dostoevsky, a former atheist, he decided that's what you're doing anyway. You've reached a point where you've concluded that nothing is real, nothing matters. And so Dostoevsky saw in socialism something that was incredibly dangerous, a pernicious philosophy. And so it's interesting that once Dostoevsky converted, he becomes an enemy of socialism of the first order. His writings dealt with this, probably most condemningly in one of his books called, that sometimes is translated as The Possessed. It's better translated as Demons. One Russian translator said, this has been translated as The Possessed for a very long time, but Dostoevsky is actually getting at something a great deal more. He's not talking about socialists who have themselves been possessed by this spirit of atheism. He's saying they are the possessors. They are the devils themselves. And so he gives this picture of what will happen if these people ever gain the reins of power. And in that sense, Dostoevsky is thought of as something of a prophet, because Dostoevsky predicted the genocides of the 20th century. He said it's coming. This kind of philosophy, these people, if they ever reach their stated goal of having political power, what will the world look like when it's run by people who don't believe that there's a God in the next world to judge what you do in this one? These are people who believe that the state is eternal. That's their God. They believe that ideas matter more than people. And anyone who believes that won't think twice of annihilating 1 million for the sake of some higher cause. And this is a theme that comes out again in Crime and Punishment. And you know, it's very interesting to me how far ahead of his time Dostoevsky was, because early in Crime and Punishment, I remember reading Crime and Punishment for the first time and how much it excited my mind. You know, I just couldn't wait to grapple with the ideas that Dostoevsky was presenting in there. And early in the novel, his central character, Raskolnikov, who was an arrogant college student and who has decided that he's very clever and he really kind of knows it all. He writes a paper in which he theorizes, and this isn't a direct quotation, but it's pretty close, where he says this: if it were necessary to kill 1, 10, or 100 people in order to make the discoveries of a Newton or a Kepler known to the world, then you would be justified in killing the 1, 10, or the 100. Now, he wrote that book in 1866. Adolf Hitler would say, amen to that. By the way, I mean, he wrote that as a Christian. He was saying, he wasn't endorsing that philosophy. He's saying, there are people who are starting to buy into this. Friedrich Nietzsche would push a philosophy like this. And Friedrich Nietzsche was born in, I think 1844, so overlapping with the life of Dostoevsky. This reflects, this was a worldview that was in the academy and was trickling down. That there was this idea that somehow this sort of thing is possible. And I've wondered, I'm playing with this theme many times, what would have happened at Nuremberg? What would have happened at the Nuremberg trials post-World War II if the Nazis had said, the major war criminals had said, yes, we did kill 6.5 million Jews and a couple of million more in the gas chambers. And yes, we did conduct all kinds of grotesque experiments on those people and we plundered their wealth. We did. But before you stand in judgment of us, know this: we have solved cancer, we have solved, infant mortality problems and rates, hunger, the energy crisis, whatever. What would have happened if they had stepped forward with extraordinary scientific advances and said, this was a small price to pay for the advancement and the betterment of humanity? Because that was the philosophy that was driving what they were doing. It was for the betterment of humanity in their mind. Stalin, when asked by Lady Astor, when are you going to stop killing people? He said, when it's no longer necessary. You know, we need to build a big dam, and that means press ganging 100,000 people. And if they die, we just press gang 100,000 more. But it's for the betterment of humanity. At Nuremberg, it's interesting to me that Albert Speer and Wernher von Braun had roughly the same credentials in terms of, on their record. Their crimes were more or less the same. Neither had ever killed anyone personally. Both of them had turned a blind eye to slave labor and had done had benefited from it at least somewhat. But Albert Speer was an architect. We didn't need any more architects. Wernher von Braun was a rocket scientist. And if you go to Huntsville, about every other building is named after Wernher von Braun. I think it's interesting that the Lynn Henley Library was getting rid of a bunch of books, and I took a bunch of, those little biographies for kids. And one of them in there was a book from the 1960s that's Wernher von Braun, and what a great American Wernher von Braun was. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He invented the aggregate 4 rocket, also known as the V2, which annihilated London. But he was a great American, old Wernher von Braun. You see the problem? You see where a philosophy like that goes? And Dostoevsky would have said, told you. Because that's pragmatism. We're going to forget this over and above this. Where are our values? Was justice actually done at a place like Nuremberg? Dostoevsky would have said that was utterly pragmatic. That wasn't absolute Christian values that were being applied there, because if they were, Wernher von Braun would have gone to jail like everybody else or hanged from a rope. Dostoevsky's themes are wonderful things. When I taught at Altamont years ago, I loved to assign Dostoevsky because it was a sneaky way to get the gospel in. Who is going to say you can't read Dostoevsky? I may not be able to assign the Gospel of John, but I can get Dostoevsky in there because he's one of the greatest novelists ever. And he raises all these themes that young people start grappling with. Well, is it justifiable to kill those people in order to make those discoveries known to the world? Raskolnikov says it is. Let's see if he's right. And Dostoevsky works out those themes in his novels. Dostoevsky himself as a man, I don't know that if you'd known him, you would have thought he was a great Christian man. So maybe I should say this is a story of 5 great Christian men and one so-so Christian man who wrote great Christian things. Like Victor Hugo, by the way. Dostoevsky, his marriage to Maria was a failure. She died in 1864, and Dostoevsky remarried in 1867. Now, throughout this time, Dostoevsky, again, as I say, a man of passions, and this issue of passion comes up a lot in Dostoevsky's writing, particularly the Brothers Karamazov, and a little book called The Gambler, where Dostoevsky wrestled with his own sin and how the theme of will versus the gospel is a theme that runs through the writing, that on the one hand, this is Romans 7. On the one hand, I want to serve Christ. I want to be this, but I'm drawn to be this. When I think of The Gambler, I always think of this, I can't remember, a James Garner Western where he is a compulsive gambler. And anytime he hears the ball bearing in the roulette wheel, little beads of sweat begin to appear. And he uncontrollably moves to the roulette wheel and he just loses everything. And everyone knows this about him. They know he can't control himself. Dostoevsky was a compulsive gambler. And he lost fortunes and he made them overnight a lot. On his honeymoon to his second wife, Anna, he lost everything at the roulette table, including her clothes. And so it is perhaps to the betterment of the world that, like Dickens and like Winston Churchill, he was forced to write in order to make money. So when he hit rock bottom, what did he do? He wrote in order to try to keep the debt collectors away. He was sued many times. He was pursued. He went to Western Europe to escape those who were seeking him for the money that he owed. And in addition to that passion, Dostoevsky was a man of a hot temper. I love what the biographer of Tolstoy says. Tolstoy says that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky hated each other because they were both brilliant and so much alike. Tolstoy became so upset with the Russian novelist Turgenev that he challenged him to a duel. Turgenev was so terrified of Tolstoy, who was a big man, that he fled Russia and went to Western Europe. And Tolstoy, who was kind of big-hearted, he was, as Dostoevsky was, who was a man who kind of come down after things like that, felt so ashamed of himself as a Christian. Kind of, sort of. He loved T.D. Jakes. He denied the Trinity. Tolstoy wrote a letter to Turgenev apologizing profusely. Took months to make it to Western Europe. In the meantime, Turgenev is so ashamed of his own cowardice that he feels that to regain his honor, he must fight and if need be, die against Tolstoy. And he writes a letter back accepting the challenge. Both missed each other. So here's the apology coming, and he writes his letter saying, I accept your deal, before he receives the apology. Tolstoy's biographer says it's a really good thing that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, who knew of each other but never actually met, did not meet, because they surely would have killed each other. Because if Tolstoy had challenged Dostoevsky to a duel, Dostoevsky would have accepted on the spot and we would have been denied the greatest literature in the Western canon. The two of them had the same agent and were publishing serially. I believe it was Crime and Punishment. I believe this is right. Two of their greatest novels, and I can't remember which ones, but I think it was Crime and Punishment and War and Peace were being published serially at the same time in the same Russian magazine. And some say that the two of them were writing their chapters in response to each other, because Dostoevsky was much more orthodox in his theological views than Tolstoy. And they would read each other's chapters and say, no, you're wrong. And here they would come back at each other again. Tolstoy's wife told him to stop publishing it that way. She said, it's brilliant. You're giving away your greatest novel. Don't. All for the sake of a few bucks. Wait and publish it all at once. Dostoevsky, for his part, spent so much time in and out of, we'll say, rehab, and suffering from his epilepsy and from running from his creditors and so forth. And then there were the women that, again, the sirens that he just couldn't seem to avoid. And when he married Anna in 1867, this really became the love of his life. Anna was a stenographer for Tolstoy. She was 21 at the time. He was 46. He was single. She was single. He dictated his writings, and the story goes that Dostoevsky had grown kind of sweet on her, and in order to propose to her, or at least test the waters to see if she was interested, he came up with this idea of a novel, fictitious, in which this older painter falls in love with this younger woman, and he asks her what she thinks of the plausibility of the plot. And she says that she thinks it's quite plausible. Things like this could happen. And he said, well, imagine that I'm the painter and you're the... And she said, well, then I would say that I will love you forever. And so he married her. And Anna becomes really significant to us because it's in the last 10 years of Dostoevsky's life that he produces his greatest work. And it's because she took care of him in his epileptic fits, and she kept the debtors away. She took over all of his business affairs. She saw that he stayed away from the gambling tables. She saw that he was proper, that he had a proper home, and that he had proper meals and this kind of thing. And she kept all of his lecherous family members away who were always taking his money. And so she took over the business, even right down to the negotiation of his books and how much he received and so forth. And so in the last 10 years of his life, he produced The Demons, The Idiot, and The Brothers Karamazov. These are massively important works, all during that period of time. Prior to that, he was productive, but not nearly so productive as after this woman entered his life and gave it a sense of order. Dostoevsky is a figure that, I think from an intellectual point of view is so incredibly important to the Christian faith, because Dostoevsky, not only does he foresee politically where things are headed, but Dostoevsky understood, and this is for me something I feel very passionate about, that the Christian faith, yes, it gives us hope of eternity. Yes, it gives us hope of the forgiveness of sins. Yes, it gives us meaning in this life. But Dostoevsky would say it's way more than that. The Christian faith, when it is not adhered to, when we throw it off in this world, we suffer consequences right here and now. Dostoevsky, I would have to credit largely for the book I wrote, The Grace Effect, because this is a major theme that I'm pushing forward in that book. I quote him at length. Dostoevsky was saying these very things. You know, if you drive Christianity from the culture, it's going to lead to these things: totalitarianism and genocide. It's just a matter of time. I think we would agree that that's what we've seen, because you redefine humanity. Man becomes a temporal being, he becomes an animal like any other, and you begin to treat him like that. You find justification, like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, for killing man for somehow the betterment of humanity. If any of you have ever spent any time in China, this philosophy still is very much at work there. Russia, still very much at work. North Korea, absolutely. But in many other parts of the world, where again, human beings, they're just raw materials for some other thing that you're building. You reverse the order as God had intended it. And Dostoevsky drives home this notion that God's truth is eternal, it is unchanging, and it is absolute. I thought it was interesting. I couldn't help but think, I wonder how Dostoevsky, I think I can guess how Dostoevsky would have reacted to an article that was recently published in the New York Times, which I wrote an article in response to it called "Thus Saith the Left." Some of you, if you're on that little private mailing list that I send out, some of you perhaps read it. But the article was published by an op-ed writer for the New York Times. His name is Frank. I don't know how you pronounce his last name. I don't know if it's Bruni or Bruni, B-R-U-N-I. Bruni? Yes? He wrote in this piece for the New York Times, he said that Christians must be made to take homosexuality off the sin list. Off the sin list. Now let me, rather than just simply telling you what I think about that, let me tell you what I think Dostoevsky would have said about that. First of all, he'd have probably penned a whole novel in response to that. But second of all, he would have, I think, very quickly pointed out God's truth is eternal. It's absolute, and we don't make the sin list. He made the sin list. I think Dostoevsky would have quite readily removed many things from the sin list had it been up to him, because sin was something he really and truly grappled with. The next thing I think he would have pointed out is, Mr. Bruni, you are flirting with a dangerous philosophy, because what you're suggesting is that truth isn't eternal. You're suggesting that it's determined by the time and place in which we live. And what was the majority view on slavery in 1860 America? What was the majority view on the so-called Jewish question in in 1933 Germany. If you don't believe that God's truth is eternal truth, you're anchorless. You are all sail, no anchor, and what you're going to end up doing is putting your finger in the air and determining morality based on majority opinion. And that is no way to determine morality at all. And so this idea, which he hammers again and again and again throughout his novels, is that God's truth is eternal and it is not in any way tethered to public opinion. And these are wonderful themes. So again, in Crime and Punishment, it's this idea that a man is just simply raw material, and if you need to kill a lot of them in order to somehow advance the cause of humanity, so be it. In Crime and Punishment, it is this theme of the eternity of Jesus Christ. Let me pray. If you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them. If you'll need to dart off to work, then by all means do so. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the great novels of Dostoevsky, which synthesize so much of the truth that is found in Scripture, and gives us a very interesting understanding of how that interacts with the world. Father, I imagine, like Dostoevsky, we are very aware of our own sin. We're very aware of the fact that we are full of contradictions and competing desires. On the one hand, to serve you, and yet on the other, we find ourselves just weighed down by the cares, by the sins of this world, the temptations of this world. Father, I pray that you would help us to focus on you and to make use of those skills, those talents that you have given us, and put them into your service. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.